Good morning. I'm going to pile on the journal papers and factors that we all need to maybe think about. As a co-chair, I want to implore you to take the event survey so that we can assess the value of this experience for everybody and keep improving them as we go. My disclosures, I do receive royalties on a variety of knee systems, and I consult for a variety of companies. So my goal is to make the case that particular implant design features or surgical alignment can positively influence total knee arthroplasty, weight-bearing, maximum flexion. The method that I'll use is to sample some of the historical literature and then share some more recent work using 3D radiographic studies of knee flexion with various arthroplasty designs. And really the goal here is just to have the consideration of, are you achieving the kind of range of motion and weight-bearing activities with the implants that you're using, or are there things that we might be able to take advantage of surgically or alignment or design-wise that would help you further increase weight-bearing flexion in your patients? We've already heard that achieving good functional flexion is important to the satisfaction of patients receiving total knee arthroplasty, and obviously in younger, more demanding and patients, as well as those in a variety of Eastern cultures, achieving large weight-bearing range of motion is extremely important. If we look at the historical literature on total knees up to around 2000, it seemed that regardless of the type of implant or surgical technique that was implemented, you're getting about 110 degrees of flexion, seemed to be about the norm. At that time, a lot of us were curious, can we do better? Is it implant or surgery, or what are the factors that contribute to that? And so I'll cite three different papers that I was involved in. And this one shows for 121 knees with fixed bearing, mobile bearing, CR, PS, so a whole gamut of different arthroplasty designs, that there was a very strong statistical relationship that if you are able to get the femur more posterior with respect to the tibial plateau, you get larger weight-bearing range of motion, and that was about 1.5 degrees more functional flexion for each millimeter of posterior femoral translation. Here's one that looked at the reconstructed femoral geometry, and this is in CR knees, and I think that's an important distinction. And that said that if you are able to restore, oh boy. If you're able to, there we go. Yeah, that doesn't work. Okay. If you're able to restore the natural posterior condylar offset, as you see in the lower right, you tend not to lose passive flexion. As you diminish that posterior condylar offset, statistically, you lose 6 degrees of passive flexion for each millimeter reduction of the posterior condylar offset. So a pretty dramatic relationship there. This has been evaluated in a lot of studies since this publication, and I would point out that many of those have been done with PS knees, where the first factor that I pointed out may overcome this factor. And finally, looking at the implanted posterior tibial slope of the implant, this is a cadaver study that simply looked at the flexion angle at which posterior impingement occurred. So this would be relevant to patients who have the capability to flex very deeply. And this suggested that you get 1.7 degrees more flexion until impingement with each additional degree of posterior tibial slope. So as an implant designer, I look at these as basically ingredients that we might use in varying proportion to create different recipes to achieve deep weight-bearing flexion according to the philosophy of the particular implant being used. And then around this time, a variety of different implant designs came out, fixed-bearing asymmetric CR, some PSs that were designed for high flexion, several of them, bicruciate substituting that had anterior-posterior cams, and other fixed-bearing PS designs. And what you saw was that at least in these reports, that now the mean flexion had increased from roughly 110 to somewhere 120 to 130 degrees. So what about with the medial pivot arthroplasty designs? There have been a number of fluoroscopic studies, a number that my group has conducted, as well as others, that have looked at patients with a variety of medial pivot arthroplasty designs doing maximum flexing activities. Here's a summary of that. You can see that the first author in the left column, the particular medial pivot or medial constrained design in the second, the activity. And what I'll point out is that in these maximum flexion activities, what you're seeing is somewhere between 110 and 130 degrees average functional flexion. You're seeing somewhere between 0 and 10 degrees of tibial internal rotation in those maximally flexed positions. And when we look at the posterior, that would be a negative number translation of the lateral condyle, you're looking at something like 4 to 10 millimeters of posterior translation. I note that in the order of that table, basically the MRK would have the most lateral congruity going to the least to the bottom. Now here is similar studies with a variety of other implant types, inclusive of CRs and asymmetric CRs and high flex PSs and BCSs. And what you see is that the range of maximum flexion is not very different. That is, it's somewhere between 100 and 130 in the different activities. I think there's probably a bias to a little bit higher tibial internal rotation if you just kind of blur your eyes and see, this is not scientific, it's just the numbers in the bottom table look to be a little bit bigger than the numbers in the top table. And similarly, in some of the different designs, especially those that have a post and cam pushing the femur back with flexion, it looks like there's more translation ongoing in those different designs. But again, the key point here is that the flexion looks about the same. Do all of these methods result in differences in flexion? No. There's been a number of studies that suggest there's other factors that are more important. And is it always good to get maximum flexion? At least this study said no, and that in fact patients who achieved extremely high flexion early postoperatively actually had a higher degree of femoral implant loosening. So it's not an unalloyed good thing, especially early on. So to conclude, weight-bearing total knee arthroplasty flexion appears to have increased with time. Perhaps that is partially due to implant design factors. Surgical techniques, rehabilitation, and the patients have all changed over the last 3 decades. A number of mechanical factors have been shown to affect flexion performance, and we might think about changing those ingredients with different recipes to suit whatever taste you may have. And I would say that based on the literature, the medially stabilized knees exhibit relatively modest posterior femoral translations and tibial rotations, yet they are achieving essentially the same weight-bearing deep flexion as the other design philosophies. So maybe that'll be part of our conversation here. The long-term results of each of these recipes remains to be monitored, and I'll look forward to your questions. Thank you.